Last week we said that if you want to start at the beginning, you have to start at the beginning, right? So did we start at the beginning last week? That's the question. Last week we spoke about the introduction to Keser. In other words, we've got 10 Sefiros that we're going to be exploring, which operate in two ways, or at least we're going to be exploring two ways. There's the 10 Sefiros themselves, the structure of the all of existence, and then there's the reflection of those 10 Sefiros in the 10-faceted structure of our own neshamas. We touched on a lot of that last week. We spoke about Ratzon as being this deep-seated motivation that effectively drives the whole system, because that's what Keser does. It drives the entire system. It motivates, it ignites the entire system. So in our experience as people, what that speaks to is Ratzon, the very deep-seated drives that we have to achieve those things that are central to our lives. And the most powerful or deepest, most profound Ratzon that we have is the Ratzon to be able to live, to survive. That's why survival is such a powerful driver in the human experience. I don't want to use the word instinct because I think it takes away from what we're trying to convey over here, that this is something that comes from our neshama. Now, what that also tells you, about Ratzon, is that Ratzon is not confined to the rational. So you see that very profoundly, right? When a person is in a, God forbid, life and death situation, they don't behave in a rational way because there's this very deep part of themselves that is activated under those circumstances. So they behave in a way that is not necessarily rational. So let's focus on that non-rational. I'm not saying irrational, because very often people hear the word irrational as having a negative connotation. So let's say that non-rational response. What else is there in our spiritual experience that is both very powerful and profound and fundamentally non-rational? Because that's also going to speak to what Keser means in our experience. So what else do we have in our spiritual development? Something that is very profound, very powerful, and non-rational. Anything come to mind? Is what? Faith. Faith is non-rational. And faith is very much at the core of what drives us. And that's the fascinating thing about faith, emunah, is that you don't necessarily expect what it's going to do to you. And that's why we did speak about this last week, how people react under very adverse circumstances. They react in ways that are incredibly powerful and ways that they themselves wouldn't have expected. They would actually see themselves as being irrational in those particular moments where faith exists. By the way, one of the ways in which faith is irrational, and I know this might sound a little bit negative, is in the sense that it produces Jewish guilt. Because Jewish guilt is not rational. It doesn't necessarily make sense that we should feel bad about something in our Judaism that we're not necessarily doing. I feel this happens often, maybe it happens to you as well, but it certainly happens to rabbis, and specifically to Chabad rabbis, because we're often confronting people in unexpected circumstances, asking them to do mitzvahs. So I had exactly this happen to me on Friday, where I offered an individual to put on tefillin, and his first thing to tell me was how long it's been since he's last put on tefillin. I didn't ask you that. Why are you apologizing? This is not a confession. It's just simply a yes or no question. Would you like to put on tefillin? Yes or no. And the yes could be, I'd like to put on tefillin. And the no could be, I've already put on tefillin. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm not interested. But there was nothing in that question that said, you have to tell me how bad you feel about the fact that you're confronting a rabbi who's now offering you to put on tefillin, and it brings up for you when last you put on tefillin. That's irrelevant, to me at least. But that's how faith is. It doesn't behave rationally, and it's really powerful. Of course. I had another interesting example, by the way, the Shabbos before, where there was an individual who came for a simcha, came to shul, somebody 81 years old, and told me that the last time that he was in shul was at his bar mitzvah. Right? And again, it's the same kind of thing. But I didn't ask you, you don't have to come over to me the first time we ever meet and start unpacking how long it is since you haven't been in shul. And that Jewish guilt, which is so endemic to the Jewish experience, also speaks to this idea called Keser. So I think we've done a fairly decent job of explaining what Keser is in the human experience. We did end off last week by saying that all of what we have discussed is only the Chitzonius HaKeser. It's the more accessible or more, for lack of a better word, superficial dimension of Keser, because we're still going to discover that there's a deeper dimension of Keser, which we'll still get to. But before we do that, we have to ask ourselves a different question, which is, that's how it relates to us in our experience. But we are just a metaphor. The human experience is a metaphor for how the divine system of the Sefiros works. So if Keser in the human experience is that deep-seated motivation that drives the entire system, that gets my brain working, that activates the emotional responses that I have, that motivates me, think about it this way. When you really care about something, when you're really motivated about something, you'll be more eloquent when you speak about it. You'll be much more inclined to act on it. So it's going to affect every single facet of who we are and how we behave. What about in Hashem's context? What would Keser / Ratzoin mean in Hashem's context? Any thoughts?
Everything.
What do you mean, everything?
Everything he does, everything that he gives us, everything.
Okay, so the thing is this. The minute we talk about expressions like give, or even if you want to use the term create, we're not talking about Keser. We're already talking about what Keser has activated. So the question is, in Hashem's reality, what is the Ratzon? So that's why we began last week with a quotation from the Midrash that says, that Hashem had a will, he had a motivation, that he wanted to experience, whatever that means. I mean, I'm using a human term, experience. Obviously, in Hashem's context, experience is misguided. But Hashem wanted to have a home in the lowest of all places, of all realities. So that's the driver. So what does Hashem want? Let's unpack this a little bit further. There's a pretty well-known midrash that tells us that the reason the first word of the Torah has an enlarged letter, and it happens that that letter is a base, which has a numerical value of 2, is because it wants to tell us Be-Reishis also could be read as base Reishis, that there are 2 things that are assigned the designation Reishis, which is the beginning of an entire reality, and it's because of those 2 things that Hashem created the world. Be-Reishis, for the sake of the 2 things that are called Reishis. What are they? The Midrash goes on to quote verses in Tanakh that illustrate that the word Reishis is used to refer to the Jewish people and is used to refer to the Torah. So what is Hashem's Ratzon? What drives Hashem, so to speak, to create the world? And the world does not only include planet Earth or even the physical universe. The world means everything, from the highest spiritual reality all the way down to the smallest subatomic particle. What drives all of that? What's the Ratzon? Hashem's Ratzon is not the world. Hashem's Ratzon is what will happen in the world. Is that we will engage with the Torah and therefore we'll turn this world into Hashem's home. That's the Ratzon, that's what's driving everything. Again, let's use ourselves as the metaphor, because it's really easy to relate to this in terms of the human metaphor. Let's say that you have a Ratzon, you have a very deep desire to have a home. In fact, having a home is such a deep desire that the Gemara tells us, Mi she'ein loy bayis, any person who does not have a home, ein loy adam, is not a complete human. That's how deep the drive is to have a home. Now there's a big difference. Mi she'ein loy bayis, any person who doesn't have a home, ein loy adam, is not a complete human. It does not say a person who doesn't have shelter is not a human. It says bias. And the implication of a bias is a home. That's very personal. For example, if somebody were to offer you that I'm going to send you to a different 5-star hotel every month for the next year, who's in? So on the face of it, people will say, oh, I'd love that. It's amazing. You're going to send me to a 5-star hotel and they're going to wine and dine me and somebody else is going to take care of all the cleaning, etc. It's all very nice for the first week or 2. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how beautiful the accommodation is, doesn't matter how well they look after you, doesn't matter how stunning the views. At the end of the day, we need to have a place that we can call home. And so it doesn't matter how beautiful the cruise was or the first class ticket on the airplane or the 5-star or 6-star hotel that you went to, when you come home, there's a certain comfort in coming home. So when the Torah tells us over here that the person who doesn't have a home is not a complete person, we're not talking about a person who doesn't have amenities. We're talking about a person who doesn't have a home. That's why you'll see homeless people will create an environment that they can consider to be home. Whatever scraps of materials they use, a person needs, there's a very deep ratzon to have a place that I could identify as my turf. Now, part of that is going to include the fact that it has to have my touch. That's why no two people have the same homes. Even if you buy off plan in a residential development where everything is in the same style, at the end of the day, every person will transform it into their home. Because what's so deep about a home is it expresses who I am. Now, I don't know if anybody here has ever had the experience, and that's a very powerful word to use, of building a home. I'm sure everybody here has at least renovated. But building a home from scratch sounds so dreamy. It sounds so beautiful. We're going to build on a blank canvas and it's going to be to spec and it's going to be exactly what we want, which is all true. Except that to get there are so many hurdles before you get there. So let's say that I meet you for the first time when you're at a site meeting, when the house is, let's say, 25% built. That's the first time I meet you. And there you are getting frustrated with the main contractor and complaining that the costs are higher than what they promised and still waiting for the electrician to arrive because he hasn't done basics, so because of that, the next level of the building has been delayed. And at the same time, you're working with somebody to come up with what the house is going to look like once you've made the shell. So you've got your interior decorator and you're looking at furniture and you're doing all of these wonderful things. And I meet you there for the very first time and I say, what are you doing? And you tell me, this is a passion project. I'm building a home. And I look at you and think, what a horrible thing to have a passion about. There you are standing in this dusty, dirty, noisy, horrible environment with people all over the place and machinery and who knows what kind of noise. And I can see that you're frustrated. You're frustrated with the contractor, etc., etc. Where's the passion in this project? So obviously what you'll then tell me is, you'll say, well, at this stage of the project, it's a little bit of a frustrating stage. But when it reaches completion, and then I have my dream home, then you'll be able to see what my original Ratzon was. Okay? So very often it's in the process that you're unable to identify the original motivator. You have to wait for the process to be completed before you can actually see what the original motivation was all about. And before you get there, it could actually be quite an ugly experience. That's why often we look around at the world and we think, what on earth was Hashem thinking? This place is a disaster. Everybody's fighting with everybody else. People disrespect the gifts of what Hashem has given us in the world. Where's the dream? So you have to know that the nature of Ratzon is that it can be very long-term, can be very patient, can wait very, in our case, years, in Hashem's case, millennia, before it actually comes to fruition. But that does not in any way diminish the power of what the original motivation and Ratzon was, just because right now is a difficult part of the process. Okay? Where do we say that in our davening? Anybody know where we say that in our davening? That you won't really be able to understand what the Ratzon was until the process is complete. Exactly. We say it on Friday night. Soif ma'aseh b'machshava techila. Now, most people understand that very simply. If you look in the English translation usually says, last in deed, first in thought, or something along those lines. Soif ma'aseh, the last thing that is done, but machshava techila was the original thought. But in Hasidus, we explain it slightly differently. Because in Torah language, the word techila could mean the beginning, as in step one of a process, or it could mean the thing that starts the entire process. In other words, it's before step one. So soif ma'aseh, the thing that you will see when the last action is taken, b'machshava techila, is what preceded even the thought. Because that's what Ratzoin is. It's something which is so deep and so part of who I am at my core that it even precedes the thoughts that will make me conscious of what my Ratzoin is. So yes, I want to have my dream home. That's true. I'm already now thinking about it. But the very deep instinctual need to have a home, that's something I don't even think about. That is something which is so much part of myself that it's just who I am. And only when I start to realize it, when I start to think about it, then I'll feel the power of it. It's the same thing with survival instinct. Survival is very core to who I am, but I don't think about it until, God forbid, there's a situation where I have to survive. So that's the depth of Ratzon, except Ratzon, as we've discussed, is the secondary aspect of Keser. So now we've got to find what is the primary aspect of Keser. This is the real core, so to speak, of where everything begins. Everything begins with what we call Pnimius HaKeser, the deeper reality or the more profound dimension of Keser. Again, Keser is always the driver of the entire system. There is the so-called visible part of that driver. This is what I want. Therefore, I'm behaving a certain way. Therefore, I'm thinking a certain way. Therefore, I'm taking these steps. Therefore, I'm investing in this particular area of life. The question is, what's driving that? So let's try work this out. What could be deeper? What could be more profound than Ratzon? Again, bearing in mind, we're not talking about Ratzon over here in the superficial sense, like I would like to have a coffee now. That's not real Ratzon. We're talking about Ratzon in the sense that this is one of my core drivers. And we identified last week that the average person probably has 2 or 3 core drivers in their life. The things that are my passions, that I absolutely care about, that if you rob me of those things, life is no longer worthwhile. So what drives those drivers? Those drivers. Well, what drives that? Let's try work this out. So again, let's use the example which was the core example of Ratzon, the will to live. What drives me to want to live? Funny question, right? What drives me to want to live? Anybody got a good answer for that? What? Everybody's going to say instinct. Instinct drives me to want to live. Okay? What drives me to want to live? To have a family. And what happens if a person, for whatever reason it is unable to have a family? Would they not have a drive to live? Of course they'd have a drive to live, right? They would have a drive to live. Okay, so what causes me to have a drive to live? Okay, is that a difficult question? Fine, so let's use a different example that's not so difficult. Let's say that a person has a particular passion in life, and we had various examples that you brought up last week. The example of connecting with people, making a difference, connecting to Hashem, any one of those things. Let's talk about making a difference, because that's an easy one to use. So there are people who are driven, their whole life is, I need to make a difference. I need to, whatever that difference means, and different people interpret it in different ways. Some people want to make a difference humanitarian-wise. Some people want to make a difference spiritually. Some people want to make a difference physically. Some people through their art. Some people through their music, whatever it is. But let's say that a person is driven by this very, very deep will to make a difference. What drives that will? In other words, why do they want to make a difference? Now this is already a clue. Why do they want to make a difference?
A desire to be individual.
A desire. So why do they want to be individual? Who said meaning? Meaning. What does meaning feel like? What does meaning do for us?
Meaning.
Purpose. What does purpose do for us?
Inspiration.
It doesn't. Inspiration is the Ratzon. Okay, good. So purpose gets us to be driven to do something. What does purpose feel like? What does meaning feel like? It's like, okay, but excuse me saying it, being nauseous also from the gut. No, I'm not disagreeing, but we have to just define this better. What does that mean? What does it mean it's from the gut? What does that mean?
It's natural. It's born in.
Many things are natural. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're deep. I'm saying.
When the baby comes out from the breast,
Okay, so what does that tell you?
that baby's one already on its way to one to live.
Fine. What does it tell you about meaning and purpose? Nothing. A baby is not crying about meaning and purpose, right? Baby is crying because they realize what's just happened to them. They've entered this reality, right? Okay. So, okay, can I use a different example just for a second? Would you agree that one of the most common drivers that people have in life is to have a family? I'm not saying that every single human being has it, but it's a very common, probably one of the most common shared drives that humans have is that they want to have a family. Okay, so now the person has a family. What does it feel like to have a family? What's the word or words that you would use to capture fulfilled? Okay, and a person could also be fulfilled if they had a particular project and now they've successfully completed the project. So I'm agreeing that the word is fulfilled. What does that feel like? Complete, which is similar to saying fulfilled, right? So heartwarming. Okay, heartwarming is a good expression. I'm surprised that nobody here is using our Jewish expression, nachas. Now, how do you translate nachas? Why not? Exactly. You cannot translate nachas because nachas doesn't equate to a single word or emotion, which is why fulfillment and completion are good synonyms. When a person feels nachas, it's not just that you feel this was great. We did something. You don't turn around when you get nachas from your child or your grandchild. You don't turn around to your spouse and say, look at that. We pulled it off. It's not about that. It's something which is so deep. That's what I said before, from your gut. It's something which is so deep, so profound. But I wouldn't say it's one part of the body. I would say that it encompasses everything about the body. Right? So, or not only the body, the mind, the emotions. So let's say, for argument's sake, when you reach that point, as you know, for those people who've had this brocha, you've reached that point of having grandchildren, right? Which they always say is the reward for not having taken out your children. So when you reach the point of having grandchildren, a grandchild walks through the door, you already feel nachas. They don't have to say anything, they don't have to do anything, nothing. They can break all the laws of your house, right? All the things that children were never allowed to do, they're allowed to do. It's this incredible nachas, right? So now let's try and understand what nachas means, because nachas is obviously what very deeply and subconsciously drove me to have such a ratzon to have a family. Meaning to say, what drove me to have a family wasn't a sense of religious obligation necessarily, because then it would be unique only to religious people. So what drives me to have a family is that there's this very deep part of the human being that can only be fulfilled once you have a family. So we need a word for that. And again, this is an illustration. There are other kinds of ratzon that are driven also by a similar kind of thing to nachas. Just nachas is not really the right word, because nachas is very much about the experience of us and family members, or maybe the achievement of something that we've done. But because we've identified that life itself is one of the most potent and impulsive instinctual drives that we have, so there's got to be something equivalent, and nobody's living for the nachas, right? Now, God forbid if a person has a life or death situation, what's driving them is not the incredible pleasure that they'll have from life. So we've got to work out another word for this. And so we're going to use a word which is a really interesting word, because it's a word that has a translation, and it's not the translation that's going to be helpful for us. Okay? Which is often the case. Meaning to say, we translate words into English for utilitarian purposes, because we need a translation, but doesn't always capture the essence of what it's supposed to be telling us. And this is one of those words. Before we get there, how was Shabbos?
Wonderful.
Beautiful, right? What's so special about Shabbos?
Shabbos, my great-grandchild.
Oh, there you go, right? So what's so special about Shabbos? Give me the word. What Shabbos is the day of, everyone's going to get this wrong. Shabbos is the day of rest. Everybody says rest, right? Connection. So what does the Torah say? What does the Torah say? Does the Torah say this is the day of rest? Does it say that? Right? Mekadesh HaShabbos, right? That is Zachar Yom HaShabbos, the Kadosho. It's a day of sanctifying, right? But there's another thing also that it says about Shabbos. Also not in the Chumash, but in Tanakh. V'karasa l'Shabbos oineg. Right? And everybody tells you about this. Oineg Shabbos. Oineg Shabbos. How would you translate Oineg Shabbos? The enjoyment of Shabbos. Terrible translation. For two reasons. Reason number one is, between you and I, is every Shabbos enjoyable?
No, sometimes.
Depends who your guests are. Depends how long the parasha is.
No, this one.
Depends how early Shabbos ends. Maybe you don't get enough time to have a shlof. There are many variables that could make it more, or it's too long, that could make it more or less enjoyable. It's not a given, just because it's Shabbos, it's automatically enjoyable. What if you live far from shul and it's raining? Or it's boiling hot and you've got to wear all these frum clothes, right? It's not necessarily a given that it's going to be enjoyable. That's reason number one why this is a mistranslation. Reason number two, put that aside. What are the things that you're supposed to do in order to have Oineg Shabbos? Nice food. Let's start there. Nice food. Food's a big thing, right? Food is a big thing, and it does say this in halacha that you're supposed to have basar, v'dogim, and mat'amim, all these wonderful things. So let's have a lot of food. But we happen to live in the 21st century, where everybody is constantly self-conscious about what they're eating and what's in what they're eating and how many calories are they eating and is it the healthiest kind of food and cholesterol levels and etc. etc. Suddenly it's not such an oineg to have oineg Shabbos. Okay, separation is true. Separation is true. The question is, what does oineg mean? And this is going to be very profound. People believe that oineg Shabbos is something we create as we do things, and that gives us the pleasure of Shabbos, and that is misguided. And I'll tell you why it's misguided. That's true, but that's another whole discussion. What does an extra soul mean? So I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of weeks about something that I heard from Dr. Rodney Unterslak many years ago. And it's like I think about it often, but the last few weeks specifically, it's come up again. He said that the biggest challenge of living in the modern world and the greatest cause of anxiety and stress in the modern world is choice. So the minute you have many choices, you obviously have the anxiety about making the correct choices. So Lahavdil, Steve Jobs, I don't know if you ever saw his famous thing that he said he wore the same clothes, well, not the same clothes, but the same style clothes every single day to eliminate that choice and the stress of that choice. So he doesn't have to get up first thing in the morning already stressing, what am I going to wear? So he knows what he's going to wear, his jeans and his turtleneck, that's it. Now you got that from us, right? I mean, in the rabbi world, it's really simple. You just go to the thing, pull out a white shirt. It's really simple. So first thing in the morning, you've eliminated the stress of choice. Now, if you think that the stress of choice is only about choices that are major choices, it's not. It's not. It's all these irrelevant choices that create so much stress for us, including, if people are online and now they're deciding, do I reply to this person's status or do I watch that thing that they posted, etc. You don't think about all these micro choices, but they all add a whole lot of stress to us. What Shabbos does is it eliminates the majority of those choices. I can't now choose what I'm going to cook. I can't choose what I'm going to watch on TV. I can't choose where I'm going to drive, etc., etc. It eliminates a whole lot of those choices, which means that it's removing the noise so that we could find the oineg. The exact opposite of what everybody does. Everybody creates noise around the oineg. What am I going to serve? What kind of food? What kind of this? Right? We actually create noise in the environment that is supposed to remove the noise and remove the choice so that oineg can be exposed. So it's a disconnect from the outside. That's why the word kedusha, which means to separate. So we remove ourselves from everything else that is distracting so that we can discover what's really within. That's the chap. And that's not only limited to Shabbos, by the way. We just 2 weeks ago read Parashas Vayakel. In Parashas Vayakel, Moshe tells the Jewish people about Shabbos, and in telling them about Shabbos, he uses the expression that 6 days your work shall be done. He doesn't say 6 days you shall work, even though that's elsewhere in the Torah. He says your work shall be done, which means that don't feel that you have to be in control of all of those choices while you're working. because even during the week, you should have a taste of Shabbos. So what is oineg? Oineg is something that sits at the core of who I am and then gets overlaid with all these other experiences and thoughts and expectations. And that's what hides the oineg from us. So oineg is not translated as enjoyment. It's not a good translation. Oineg would be, the better way to translate it is pleasure. And the definition of pleasure is not the pleasure that I get from things, it's rather the pleasure I get from fulfillment. And when I'm not blocking my sense of fulfillment with things, then I can experience that fulfillment. That makes sense?
Yeah. Right.
So,
Sorry. Could it be the pleasure you get from having a meaningful davening experience?
could be, absolutely. So if a person has a meaningful davening experience, we've got to work out what is a meaningful davening experience. Right? What does that mean? Because we have to be really careful. Unfortunately, very often in the spiritual realm, things look mighty similar to other things. And one version could be completely misguided and the other version could be completely fulfilling, and they look so similar. So what is a meaningful davening? A davening where we let go of all of our stuff so we can feel a connection to Hashem, as opposed to a davening where we make noise with all of our stuff, all of our needs, all of our requests. Okay? Same kind of principle. Now we know that the Gemara tells us there are various things that Hashem has put into our world which are nominal versions, or if you want to say samples, of what's going to happen in a bigger sense. And Shabbos is the sample of Mashiach. Right? Olam Haba, the world to come, the Messianic reality, which tells you what? What's Mashiach about? Not what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks Mashiach's going to come, Russia and Ukraine will make peace. People think Mashiach's going to come, the price of matzahs will come down. Like those are the things that people anticipate that Mashiach is all about. The reality is, Mashiach is about the ultimate tainug, the ultimate sense of pleasure. Pleasure that is not dependent on external things. Now, that does relate to the idea of rest. Now we can better understand what the meaning of rest is. Rest doesn't mean I'm not working. Rest means I'm not chasing. Big difference. In other words, you could have a person who's doing a lot of physical labor. They might have a long walk to shul, or they might have to, do things around the house, set the table, pack everything away after. Maybe you don't have help at home or whatever. It might be a lot of physical labor, and it could still be rest if we're not chasing. Whereas you could have a person sitting on the couch and is in a completely wound up, tense state because they're chasing the whole world from the comfort of the couch. So the time of Mashiach, which obviously is the ultimate purpose of everything, is a time of tainug. That's why the Rambam, for example, tells us that in today's world, we're supposed to obviously do what Hashem expects of us. And in the Messianic world, we'll have the pleasure of what we had done. So that tells you that Ratzon, the motivation, is what I want to do. Tainug is why I want to do it. It's going to give me that profound sense of fulfillment. It's going to give me that profound sense of pleasure. Okay? So Pnimiyus HaRatzon, which is the deeper part of Keser, Pnimiyus HaKeser, the deeper part of Keser is what? This incredible pleasure that I will have once my Ratzon is fulfilled. That's why I have this Ratzon, because I know it's going to give me so much profound pleasure. Now, the irony is that life itself does not feel like pleasure. And yet, one of the strongest motives that we have in life is to survive. So how does that square up? Because you're telling me that Tainug is the driver of Ratzon. I can see that. What drove me, even though I didn't know it was subconscious, what drove me to have a family? The incredible nachas that it would have from that family, from those children, from those grandchildren. That's what drove me. At the time, I didn't necessarily know it. What drives me to whatever particular passion project my whole life is centered on? Because I know that that's going to fill me. That's going to give me this incredible sense of worth and of value. And therefore, it's worth investing so much energy. Why do I sit there at these site meetings in the mud for my dream home? Because I know that the dream home is going to give me this incredible sense of Tainug, in fact, ironically, even when I'm not in the home. So wherever you are in the world, you're a different person because you know you have a home to go to, and it's your home, and it's made to your spec, and it's got your idiosyncrasies, and it's the place that you could kick off your shoes and nobody can criticize you. So that is your home. How then does that apply to life? How can you tell me that there's a tainug that drives life when I know for a fact that there's a rotzoin to live that is the most powerful rotzoin that I have?
We want to live forever.
We do want to live forever. That's true. That's the rotzoin.
Making something that ensures that we will.
Correct. That's true. That is all part of the rotzoin, though. That means I want to live forever. Question is why? What is that tainug? What is that pleasure? So, FOMO. So,
We want to live forever because you will experience a deep connection to Hashem.
okay, I don't know if that's true for every human being, that every human being wants to have a deeper connection to Hashem, but every human being does want to live, regardless. So what is the tainug? Here's the irony. Sometimes when a person is not, as most of us unfortunately are not, in touch with our truest self, then we don't know how to identify a tainug. We only know how to identify the fear of losing it. So you see that, for example, in a relationship, that sometimes there are people who become blasé about their relationship, and they don't realize the value of the relationship until, God forbid, it's threatened. And by the way, sidebar, could do another whole share on this, sidebar, that's why this notion that marriage is built on love is inaccurate. So what should it be built on? Giving. Fair point. What else?
Feeling like your home a sanctuary.
Make a home a sanctuary. True. But I'm talking specifically emotion. So there's an emotion called love that the secular world has created as the cornerstone for marriage. What are they missing? Hard work. Exactly. Hard work. But I'm looking for an emotion. There's another critical emotion that if that emotion is not present in a relationship, the relationship is at risk.
Compromise.
No, compromise is not an emotion.
Fear.
Appreciation, respect, all true. Fear. If I don't have the fear of losing, God forbid, the relationship, then I don't have the same drive to invest in the love of that relationship. Now, I don't have to be conscious of that fear all the time. That's not healthy. Can't walk around our whole lives fearing the worst. But if it isn't present, then I could be reckless, and I could be inattentive, and I could allow things to unravel. If a person doesn't have some degree of fear in life, then they engage in risky behavior that could, God forbid, compromise their lives. So let's say, for argument's sake, I'll use an extreme example. Let's say that somebody abuses substances, has become an addict, right? Let's just say. Until such time as they reach primal fear about what that's done to their life and to their relationships, etc., they won't be able to fix it. So that's an extreme example, but it just illustrates to you that sometimes the only way to identify that tainug is by being conscious of the potential of losing it, because we're not always deep enough, profound enough, connected enough, in touch enough to feel the tainug itself. So where do we identify it? In the potential for absence, the potential for loss.
Can I just say this? So perhaps when we want to live, we know that the alternative would be so wonderful.
Correct. So that's why in the life or death scenario, then I explode into this incredible rotten. Why? Because that's when I feel at the core of my being the opposite of the tainug of life. In other words, I take life for granted. That's how humans behave. They take life for granted. When, God forbid, there's a threat, suddenly the beauty of life jumps out at them in full HD. And that's why you'll always hear from people when they are, God forbid, facing, the best example of this would be an illness. That's when they start saying, you have to value life, value every minute, those kinds of things, because that's what brings out that tainug.
What about fear of losing your mate because you won't manage?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So the person has fear of losing their partner because how will they manage without their partner? Fundamentally, that speaks to this point. It's technicality what's going to happen. The fear illustrates the power of that love and connection. Because if there weren't that love and connection, you'd say, we'll find a way to be able to survive. In other words, that fear of not being able to manage, not the fear of not being able to pay the accounts. That's a fear of, this is a person who is my rock. How am I going to live without them? So it's an indicator of that love. Like I said, this is a whole share in its own right, not really what we're going to focus on. How does a person deal with it? That's what I'm saying. That's another whole share that I don't think we can do today. And I don't necessarily know that I have the answer for that. So, very likely. But again, I think it's beyond the scope, unfortunately, of what we can do now. So now we go back to this Midrash. What did the Midrash say? It used a very powerful word, Nis'aveh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that Hashem had a desire. That's a very powerful word. He had a desire that he should create, or that we should create, a home for him in the lowest world. Desire implies the word pleasure. It implies that there's something more than just ratzon, which is motivation or will or drive. Desire implies that this is personal. It's possible for a person to have a will or a motivation or drive because they know it's the right thing, because they feel committed, because their word is their bond, or whatever it might be. But the moment a person says desire, that implies this is about me. This touches me in a very deep and profound way. And that's what Hashem is illustrating to us. Pnimius HaKeser, which for our conversation is going to be the deepest part of the entire system that we explore, we have to consistently bear in mind that the deepest part of the whole system, what causes the will to create everything, is that Hashem's going to get nachas from us. That's essentially that Hashem is going to get nachas from us. That's effectively the driver of everything. Again, we're the metaphor. How did he design us? That one of the most profound drives in our lives is to have a family. And what will happen with that family? Those children will give us tremendous nachas, something which you can't even describe in words. We are the metaphor. So one of the most primal needs of a human being is to create a home, not just a structure, not just a shelter, but a home, a place that feels like it's mine and that I could be me in that space. And it gives me a sense of comfort and security. So why are we that way? Because Hashem's ultimate desire / nachas is to have a home in our world. So whatever we're going to be learning in these 10 Sefiros, because remember, all of this is before the 10 Sefiros, we have to just keep in mind that what's driving it all is that Hashem, the ultimate purpose of everything is us. Here, sitting in this room, because we're the ones who are going to be able to make this home that is the deepest desire that Hashem has, which is what drove the entire system.
What about an atheist?
What?
They don't want to give Hashem nothing.
True. So,
Or do they subconsciously?
well, okay, so it's a good question. Does a person who doesn't believe in Hashem subconsciously also want to give Hashem nachas? So the problem is that Hashem has designed us in such a way that we can completely disconnect from our actual value. That's why it's possible for a person, God forbid, to contemplate suicide, because he's allowed us the possibility of being able to totally disconnect from our core reality. Likewise, the person who has no awareness of Hashem or no care for Hashem, etc., that's because Hashem has allowed the possibility. It doesn't change Hashem's plan. It doesn't diminish the depth of pleasure or desire that Hashem has for this plan. It just means that this individual may...
I think that person is still driven to live.
They're still driven to live. Correct. So they're still, again, we're the metaphor. The metaphor, like a mashal, always has something that's not identical to what it is that you're trying to portray. So that's exactly the point of it. The Hashem has built it into us, and it's inescapable that we want to live and that we want to have a family, so that we should appreciate that, for lack of a better word, it's built in and inescapable that Hashem wants such a world. That doesn't mean it translates into every human having that level of awareness and depth. That's why we're here. That's why we learn these things, so it can sensitize us, so we can be more aligned with what our purpose is. But that's not a guarantee, just because we're built on a particular system. So just to use another illustration to make the same point, how does Hashem create the world? Through words. We know that. The Torah tells us that Hashem spoke everything into creation. We're the metaphor, which means that when we use words, we have the potential to create realities with those words. As is often the case, we might say something that is a compliment to another person that could come at just the right time, that could totally lift and change and shift that person in the healthiest way possible. That doesn't mean that every word that we say creates realities. So the metaphor is a watered down version, and therefore it's not a guarantee to always match up with what it represents. In Hashem's reality, it's always going to be perfect. So Hashem's desire and pleasure that is associated with this world is absolute, regardless even of the fact that, a lot of the time we're messing things up as we go.
And sorry, I think this is exactly why he gave us the Torah. He's given us this instruction and teaching to actually limit our choice.
Again, that's why base, rachis, the two things that Hashem has put out into the world in order to create that absolute pleasure, the Torah and the Jewish people. But you've made a very good observation. Part of what the Torah does is it eliminates a whole lot of choice from us, which helps because there's less noise.
If Hashem's desire to have a home in this world refer to the Beit HaMikdash, or does it refer to living in the heart?
It's a great question. So to have a home in this world, does that refer to the place in Yerushalayim, the Beis HaMikdash? Does it apply to us as individuals? And I'm going to add one layer to the question, or does it apply to the whole world? So the brief version of the answer is, we know that when Hashem told us originally to make the Mishkan, which is the prototype for what eventually would become the Beis HaMikdash, he said, Va'asili Mikdash, you make for me a sanctuary, v'shachanti b'soy cham, and I'll dwell within you. That tells us that the purpose is to dwell within us, which means two things: within us as individuals, and within us in our immediate environment, wherever that might be in the world. And that's why the Gemara tells us, Tzedakah asa kadosh baruch hu Yisrael shepizran lebein ha'umos. That when Hashem scattered us after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, scattered us around the world, it was an act of charity for us. Why? Because that allows us to create this home for Hashem in a much bigger place than just the temple in Yerushalayim. So ultimately that is the case. It's personal and it's universal.
Is it in part of every Jew or every person?
Both. We're supposed to be the leaders and the catalysts and the light and so on and so forth. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.